A few years back, my girlfriend and I, having hiked several other parts of the Appalachian Trail, decided we wanted to give the southern portion of Virginia's trail a shot. It is about 166 miles long and runs through the George Washington and Jefferson National Forests, from Roanoke County to Pearisburg in Giles County. This is definitely one of the more remote and less traveled parts of the trail, which was exactly what we were looking for. We gathered our gear and made our way to the start of the Virginia Creeper Trail to begin our journey. We had planned to end in Damascus, figuring that by the time we got there, we'd be more than ready to sleep in our own beds. It was early October, and the changing leaves were amazing. The air was crisp and cool, perfect hiking weather with beautiful scenery. Most of the trip was pretty uneventful, just your typical hike. But our last couple of nights is where things got weird. On this portion of the trail, you're supposed to camp on the trail or at a designated shelter. We didn't really want to run into other people or have anyone come up on us in the middle of the night, so we decided to ignore those suggestions and find our own spot off the trail. After a little searching, we found a clearing a bit off the path. It was perfect. We set up camp, cooked some food, talked for a while, and then snuggled up for the night. Around 2 a.m., I was awakened by my girlfriend shaking me, whispering, "Get your gun. Someone is outside, walking around our tent." She told me she had woken up to what sounded like someone running a knife or something along the side of the tent while circling us. When I hike, I carry a Colt 1911 and a judge with me, since you never know who or what you might run into in a remote area. I grabbed the judge from my pack, and we sat silently, listening for any sounds. After a few minutes of nothing but the breeze through the trees, I heard it. Snap, crunch, snap. Someone, or something, was walking in the woods behind our tent. I grabbed the flashlight and quietly made my way out of the tent. Our fire had gone out, so it was nearly pitch black, illuminated only by the dim October moon. I told my girlfriend to stay put while I checked things out. I didn't turn the flashlight on immediately, not wanting to give away my location. Instead, I waited, listening. After a few minutes, snap, crunch, crack. The footsteps sounded bipedal, judging by the pacing. I switched on the flashlight and flooded the area with light. I thought I saw someone move behind a tree. I yelled, telling them to go away and that I was armed. I kept the light trained on the area, my gun drawn, and slowly approached the spot where I thought I saw the figure. Then, from my right, I heard what sounded like someone running through the woods. I spun, facing the light in that direction, and from the original spot, I heard whoever was there take off into the woods. There was no way I was giving chase, so I returned to the campsite. I told my girlfriend what had happened, and I ended up sitting guard outside the tent in the darkness until daybreak. In the morning, I looked around for signs of who or whatever it was, and I discovered a boot print in some soft, moist dirt near our tent. It wasn't mine, and it wasn't my girlfriend's. This freaked me out, as it confirmed that someone, perhaps more than one person, had been skulking around our tent in the dark. I kept it to myself because I didn't want to scare my girlfriend any more than she already was. At this point, we were deep into the trail and still had 2 days left. That day, we walked faster than usual, trying to cover as much ground as possible. When it came time to set up camp again, I found a spot near a cliff where we could place the tent under a small overhang, preventing anyone from coming up behind us. The whole day, I had the feeling we were being followed. I hadn't seen or heard anyone, but I just had a gut feeling. We set up camp, made some food, and then retreated to the tent. I gave my girlfriend the Colt, while I kept the judge next to me, assuring her that if I slept at all, it would be with one eye open. After a while, she drifted off to sleep while I stayed awake, listening to the sounds of the night. I stayed awake for a few hours, waiting to see if anything would happen. At some point, exhaustion caught up with me and I drifted off. I awoke later to what sounded like someone going through our stuff outside the tent. I grabbed my gun and quietly woke my girlfriend, shushing her to be quiet. By the faint glow of the fire, I could see a silhouette against the tent. Someone was really out there. I yelled something like, "We are armed. Get the fuck out of here." They immediately bolted. I came out of the tent, gun drawn, ready to shoot. Our belongings were scattered everywhere. They had rummaged through quite a bit. I walked to the edge of the woods in the direction they had fled. There was a creek nearby, and I walked to its edge where a small trail ran alongside it. Down the creek, I saw a light, flickering like a lantern. Then, I saw 3 more lights emerge from the woods. I told my girlfriend to start packing up whatever she could. We were leaving, now. We gathered our valuables, left the tent and a few other items behind, and got back on the trail in the middle of the night. As we walked, I kept hearing voices off in the woods and the sound of branches snapping. Every few seconds, I looked behind us to make sure no one was following. It was nerve-wracking. If something happened, we were still a long way from anywhere and completely on our own, since we hadn't seen another hiker the entire time. I really felt like we were in serious danger. After walking for a while, I heard something in the woods behind us. As we rounded a corner, I turned and saw someone step onto the trail and just stand there, watching us. It was just before dawn, with barely any light. I couldn't make out any features, just the silhouette. I stopped and stared for a moment, then asked who they were and what they wanted. They stood silently, watching us, then turned and walked back into the woods. We picked up the pace and kept going, looking back occasionally, but we didn't see them again. Still, my gut told me they were there, watching us, for quite some time. We eventually reached the end of the trail and got to where we had parked my girlfriend's car, exhausted. We made it out of the Virginia woods without becoming a meal for a clan of cannibalistic inbred hillbillies, which is what I pictured happening in my head the entire time. I have no idea who they were or what they wanted. Maybe it was someone messing with us. Maybe it really was a clan of deformed hillbillies hunting us. I will never know because I will not be returning to find out. A couple of years ago, I was stressed out from college and big city life, so I decided to spend a long weekend in the woods doing what my city friends consider utter lunacy and what us outdoorsy people consider nirvana. Deep woods free camping. In the winter, alone. While this might sound like the beginning of a missing persons report, if you're an experienced outdoorsman, it's pretty safe. I also take a secret pleasure in being the white trash warrior as my dad always hoped I'd be. I've always hated the feeling of claustrophobia that comes with being female in the city, avoiding eye contact, not walking alone at night. When you're a girl alone out in the woods, you're in charge. You're safe within the warm embrace of your own solitary freedom. Or so I thought. I spent a few hours on the road, the surroundings getting wilder as I drove. I parked in an allowed roadside ditch and, with a compass and a map, hiked until I was about a mile from a good ice fishing spot. I was at least 4 miles from the road. I made an extremely discreet camp in a clearing, with just one small hole in the snow for my tiny tent and a little campfire. After a couple of beautiful days of hiking and relaxing around camp, I made the trek to the fishing hole. Everything was in utter winter stillness. The air was crisp, and the only signs that I wasn't in a perfect vacuum were the twitterings of birds and the distant rumblings of half-frozen waterfalls. After a mile or so of crunching along in the snow, I silently celebrated my compass skills when I arrived exactly where I had intended. I punched a hole in the thin crust of ice and set to work, fishing. My first catch came quickly. After a few weeks under a frozen surface, fish are hungry. I was feeling oddly fatigued and jumpy, so I decided to clean the fish right there and take it straight back to camp to cook. I quickly realized my fish preparation skills were rusty at best. I cursed my lack of preparation as I cut myself for the second time. Something on the edge of my senses was irritating me, but I was so focused on the slippery mess that I ignored it. The irritation grew, like the buzzing of a fly or the yammering of a sibling. I hacked and carved until I sliced my hand open again, the fish slipping into the snow. Frustrated, I shouted, "Fuck off with that whistling, will you?" Silence resumed, and then my heart stopped. Living in a college neighborhood, I had grown so accustomed to white noise that I hadn't recognized how grossly inappropriate the sound was in this context. The silence weighed on me as I broke into a sweat. The only reason a human would be this deep in the woods would be to hunt, and no hunter would give himself away like that. And if he was whistling for any other reason, shouldn't he have reacted to my outburst? Yelled something vulgar back? Apologized? Nothing. Just the total stillness of the woods. Silence as pure as it was before I spoke. Unsure if I had misheard the twittering of a bird or something, I decided the fish was a lost cause, slung my gear over my shoulder, and headed for camp. I trudged through the woods, and about a quarter mile from camp, I saw a large mass protruding from the snow. Apprehensive but drawn, like a moth to a flame, I approached. As I got closer, I realized it was a moose kill. A really good moose kill. A clean shot through the upturned eye, staring at me. Staring and saying something. Something that imposed a sense of dread on me, though I couldn't quite translate it. I ran, hard and fast. In the snow and woods, everything looked the same. I knew I was moving south, and I knew my camp was to the east. I made for the road, eventually slowing down to a weary trudge, comforted by the sight of the woods clearing ahead to make way for the country road. I looked to my left and saw my car about 50 yards away. I jogged to it and drove the lonely 15 miles to the first motel I saw. I had none of my belongings and no earthly idea why I had just abandoned ship like that. It wasn't until I was sitting up late, watching infomercials, that it started to fall together. Why would the Park Service issue free camping passes for the same stretch of woods where they allowed hunting? The moose kill defied everything I knew about hunting. Even with the snow to cool it, decomposition starts quickly in an animal that size. You might have time for a few quick pictures, but you'd want to dress it immediately. Why would someone kill a moose 5 miles into the forest? How could you ever drag it back to the road? In the morning, sleep-deprived and paranoid, I described everything I'd seen and heard to a very confused park ranger. He seemed more concerned about illegal hunting than about my crazy city girl ramblings. He offered to pick me up and take me to where I thought the kill site was. I agreed, but only if he brought a gun. He sighed in exasperation and told me when to meet him. We rode out into the woods on an ATV, with me awkwardly perched on the back like I was on the world's weirdest motorcycle. We reached a large impression in the snow where the moose had been. Blood was everywhere. There were also distinct drag marks, as if the carcass had been pulled on a tarp. The ranger said we should head back. I pointed in the direction of the drag marks and told him my camp was that way. He finally seemed to share my unease. Back at the motel, I washed my clothes in the sink and prepared to drive home in the morning. An unknown number called my phone. It was the park ranger. The moose had been dragged to my campsite. He described the scene as a huge mess. He wasn't sure if an animal had helped make the mess, but one thing was clear. Someone had cut into my tent with a knife. I asked about the rest of my belongings. He replied darkly, "You don't want them back, they're covered in moose mess." So, what happens now? Well, miss, we're just going to keep an eye out for this guy. I haven't heard of or seen anything like this before. I'm really sorry this happened. And that was it. No closure, no explanation. In the years that have passed, I've tried to reason through every possibility. A hunter who needed help but saw that I was already gone? A deranged psychopath looking for a second kill? One of my friends, after hearing the story, envisioned him as some deep-woods Sweeney Todd and dubbed him Moosey Todd. I still don't know why I didn't hear a gunshot. The whistling seems so vivid in my memory, but was it even real? One question has been definitively answered. I'll never go into the woods alone again. My brother is 7 years older than me, so when I was 9 or 10 he was in high school and had to hide from our parents that he smoked and dipped tobacco. As a result, most days after he got home from school, I was homeschooled, we'd go out into the woods for an hour or two. We lived way out in the country, in an already rural part of East Texas, so there were plenty of woods to explore. The land south of our house was owned by a mining company, and my parents didn't want us going out there. So we always crossed a fence to the north of our house and explored the woods there. It was likely some local's property that we had no business being on, but when you live out in the country, you figure you'll have plenty of warning before accidentally walking into someone's backyard. After a few months of venturing out in this area, never traveling more than an hour's distance from our house and always in the daylight, we decided one day we'd just keep walking. And walking. My brother smoked and spit into a Dr. Pepper bottle as we entered big pastures and then dove back into even deeper woods. Whenever we've talked about it, we always say we must have traveled at least a mile, though we often claim it was much farther. Eventually, we came across a circular pond, which I distinctly remember had a much higher rim on one side. My brother explained that this was because a tractor had dug it out, piling up more dirt on one side than the others. We kept going past the pond and entered another patch of woods. As we emerged, we saw the tree line curve sharply to the right, and the clearing we stood in opened up far wider. We headed in that direction, and although my memory of getting there is a bit hazy, I remember that we suddenly came across a very large white building surrounded by a high fence. There was a gate large enough for vehicles to move in and out, and a dirt road leading away from the facility. We could hear the sounds of activity and saw people walking around outside the fence near the gate. I'm afraid any further details might be colored by false memory or exaggerations from an imaginative young mind, so I'll wait to talk to my brother more before I go any further. At that moment, we both felt a spine-tingling terror, the kind that tells you something is very wrong. We were not supposed to be here. At the very least, we were going to get into serious trouble. We stood there in the middle of a clearing, gawking at some sort of facility on what was clearly someone else's property. It was something deep in the woods we had never known was there. All this time we'd spent walking around in these woods, and if we had just gone a little farther before, we would have stumbled across this place. I remember standing there a moment longer, asking my brother what it could possibly be. He said something like, "I have no clue, but we should really get the fuck out of here." The tone of his voice freaked me out, and I remember running hard back the way we came, crossing the same pond, and retracing our path as closely as possible. When we finally stopped, out of breath, my brother told me in no uncertain terms that I was never to say a word about this to our parents. They were spankers and strict when it came to grounding us, so he knew he'd be in serious trouble for taking his little brother into what was quite possibly a dangerous situation. After that day, we continued going into those woods, but never that far. Eventually, my brother got caught with a can of Skol, and my dad made him eat the whole can and puke it up on the porch. Being an easily intimidated little kid, it wasn't hard to get more information out of me about my brother's smoking and dipping habits, but I never mentioned the facility we'd found. Over the years, my brother and I have brought this story up many times. Our parents have become much more relaxed since we've grown up, and we've even told them the story, to my mother's retroactive shock. We've added other strange stories to our collection over time, as our family has always lived by large areas of land to explore, but this one remains one of our favorites. It's always, "Remember the time we almost got killed by those government researchers? Remember when we found that crazy building in the woods with people walking around it?" But for the past few days, this event has really been bugging me. I told my wife about it in detail, and she was pretty amused. I decided to look around on Google Maps at the area where we grew up, something I'm honestly surprised I hadn't done before. What I found, or rather didn't find, is really bizarre. Moving north from my old house, which has since burned down and left an ugly scar on the satellite image, I can clearly make out the woods where we spent most of our time. When I go farther north, I see several large clearings followed by more wooded areas. Eventually, I even found the circular pond, and I'm positive I can make out the higher end of the pond where my brother explained how it had been made. But when I drag the map further, I see what looks like the clearing and the sharp curve of the tree line where we saw the facility. But there's nothing there. No trace of a building, no evidence of a dirt road leading away from any structure, just pasture and more trees. In fact, when I zoom out and look at the whole area, it doesn't seem possible for there to have been an operation of the scale we saw. Just a little farther north, the land becomes pasture with houses pressed up against a county road. For people to have come and gone from that area, they would have needed a road of some kind, as well as power lines stretched out to the building. But there's nothing like that on Google. There's no clear "here it was" spot on the map. It's as if it was never there to begin with. It's been a few years since we last talked about it, so I texted my brother earlier today to ask if he still remembered that day. He called me immediately and said, "Hell yeah, man, that was a really weird day. You know how good I used to be in the woods, but that shit really freaked me out. We had to get out of there." The whole event feels more and more like we stumbled onto something we weren't supposed to see. I still remember the feeling of dread upon finding the place and knowing something bad would happen if we stuck around. My dad is a logger, specifically one who operates a tree saw. It's basically a giant machine capable of cutting down massive trees and cutting them to specified lengths. This means he spends a lot of time alone in deep forests. The way my dad's logging crew was set up, he would be told where he was supposed to cut down trees, and would get paid based on the number of trees he cut, not on how long it took him. So my dad often worked 16 to 20-hour days to finish as quickly as possible. The rest of the crew would come later to clean up the trees and ship them to the mill. He worked about 50% of the time alone, and the rest of the time with another tree saw operator named Renee. They used radios to communicate when they worked together. Sorry for the long backstory, but this is where the story starts. My dad and Renee were put on a new job site, and about 10 days in, everything was going as planned. However, they kept hearing weird chitter-chatter over the radio. The quality was so poor that no words could be understood, and no matter which radio channel they switched to, it followed them. As they progressed through the job and moved farther up the mountain, the voices on the radio gradually became more audible. Both of them agreed that something was off based on the snippets of conversation they could hear. They also started finding strange containers scattered around and signs that people had been there. This was unsettling because no one should have been there. The area was a 2.5-hour drive up a mountain, and they had spent 3 weeks clearing the road so their trucks and equipment could get through. They realized they were in a very secluded area, with people who had no business being there. The worst part was that they weren't scheduled to leave for another week. They only left occasionally to refuel the truck with gasoline for the machines, buy supplies, and sleep in campers. One day, Renee came across a tent and called my dad over. They investigated the tent and found a lone sleeping bag and a duffel bag. Inside the duffel bag, they discovered multiple pairs of children's underwear and what appeared to be a rape kit, rope, duct tape, sketches of children being molested, and photographs of children who seemed unaware they were being photographed. In the tent, they also found a small amount of food, including canned goods and an apple, which indicated the tent had been occupied recently since there was no mold on the apple. Now they were on the mountain, alone, with what was, at best, a deeply disturbed individual. Renee immediately wanted to get out of there, but my dad, being the hardest working person I've ever met, insisted they needed to finish the job and get out as quickly as possible. They decided they wouldn't use the radios except in emergencies to see if they could overhear more conversations. At this point, they were close enough to hear clearer conversations between two men, discussing mundane things like collecting water and wood for a fire. Nothing seemed abnormal, except for the fact that these men didn't belong there, and that the tent was undoubtedly theirs. At the end of the workday, my dad heard them on the radio again, talking about one of them collecting brush for a fire. My dad hopped on the radio and tried to communicate with them, saying something like, "Who are you and what are you doing here?" After this, the conversation between the men abruptly stopped, and they never spoke again over the radio. That night, Renee woke my dad up and whispered for him to grab his gun because someone was outside. My dad told me the first thing he heard when he woke up was the faint sound of footsteps. He fumbled for his gun but realized it wasn't loaded, and he had no idea where his rounds were. Renee had nothing, and calling the police was out of the question for several reasons. They then heard the doorknob jiggle, and the camper door opened. The camper was far enough off the ground that you had to jump in, and there was no ladder or footstool. The door just stayed open, and neither my dad nor Renee moved, but they heard scratching right outside the door. After 4 minutes of scratching, my dad couldn't take it any longer. He nodded at Renee and got up quietly to approach the camper door. As soon as he reached it, he was met with intense pain across his right eye, stretching to his left cheek. He had been cut and fell out of the camper, hitting the ground hard. A man with a knife got on top of him, and my dad was soon being kicked in the head by a second man behind him. Renee leaped out of the camper and managed to get the man off my dad. The second man, the one without the knife, ran away, and the man with the knife scrambled away from Renee and started running alongside his accomplice. My dad and Renee jumped into the truck and drove to the nearest hospital to treat my dad's injuries. Later, they reported the incident to the police. Both quit their jobs, and 2 weeks later, as the rest of the logging crew was finishing the job, one of them was found gagged, bound, raped, murdered, and thrown into a ditch. No one has ever been convicted of these crimes. To this day, my dad can hardly see out of his right eye, and his pupil is disfigured, resembling more of a cat's eye than a human's. He suffers from PTSD and hasn't had a good night's sleep since.